Welcome to today's video. Today's discussing one of the most confusing subjects in the entire realm of baking. What is the difference between baking powder and baking soda? Are they the same? Can I sub one for the other without changing anything else? Become a better baker by learning the real differences between baking powder and baking soda in easy to understand language. Did you know? You can substitute baking powder in place of baking soda. You'll need more baking powder and it may affect the taste, but you can't use baking soda when a recipe calls for baking powder. But wait, before continue this video, please hit subscribe button first and write down in comment section if you're already subscribed. Baking powder and baking soda are both leaveners, however they are chemically different. What is baking soda? AKA bicarbonate of soda or sodium bicarbonate. Let's start with baking soda because it's the most confusing. First, baking soda is a base. Do you remember the science experiment we all did in school? Mixing baking soda with vinegar and watching an eruption of bubbles? Usually we did this in some sort of model volcano contraption. I know you know. When you mix baking soda base with vinegar acid, you get a chemical reaction, an eruption of bubbles. A product of this reaction is carbon dioxide. The same exact reaction happens in our cookies, cakes, breads, etc. When a recipe calls for baking soda base, it usually calls for some type of acid. Like buttermilk, brown sugar, yogurt, lemon juice, vinegar, cream of tartar, molasses, apple sauce, natural cocoa powder, not Dutch process, or honey. You need this acid in the recipe to react with the baking soda, which in turn creates carbon dioxide and allows your baked good to rise. Baking soda is strong. In fact, it is about 3 to 4x stronger than baking powder. More baking soda in a recipe doesn't necessarily mean more lift. You want to use just enough to react with the amount of acid in the recipe. Too much baking soda and not enough acid means there will be leftover baking soda in the recipe. You do not want that, it creates a metallic, soapy taste in your baked. Good rule of thumb, usually use around 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda per 1 cup of flour in a recipe. Baking soda can leaven a baked good when exposed to heat. However, unless it is neutralized with an acid, your finished baked good will likely have a metallic aftertaste. What is baking powder? Baking powder contains baking soda. It is a mixture of baking soda, cream of tartar, a dry acid, and sometimes cornstarch. These days, most baking powder sold is double acting. This means that the first leavening occurs when baking powder gets wet, like when you combine the dry and wet ingredients in the recipe. This is why you cannot prepare some batters ahead of time to bake later because the baking powder has already been activated. The second leavening occurs when the baking powder is heated. Since baking powder already contains an acid to neutralize its baking soda, it is most often used when a recipe does not call for an additional acidic ingredient. However, this isn't always the case. You can still use baking powder as the leavening agent in recipes calling for an acidic ingredient. Like lemon cake. In my recipe development, I based my lemon cake recipe off of my vanilla cake recipe. I used buttermilk acid instead of regular milk for added moisture and a little tang, and subbed a little brown sugar acid for granulated sugar again for added moisture. I was pleased with the rise and taste of the cake, so I did not experiment with using baking soda. It's definitely confusing. Good rule of thumb, usually use around 1 teaspoon of baking powder per 1 cup of flour in a recipe. Why do some recipes call for both? Some recipes call for both baking powder and baking soda. These recipes contain some sort of acid, yogurt, brown sugar, etc. However, the carbon dioxide created from the acid and baking soda is not enough to leaven the volume of batter in the recipe. That's why baking powder is used as well to add necessary lift. Basically, the reason for both is because sometimes you need more leavening than you have acid available in the recipe. It's all about balance. Another reason to use both baking powder and baking soda is because they affect both browning and flavor. Fine cooking breaks it down easily. Let's take my buttermilk pancake recipe. In my recipe, buttermilk is used partly for its tangy flavor. If we used only baking soda, it could neutralize all of the buttermilk's acid. And we'd lose that tanginess. However, by including baking powder as well, which has its own acid, some of the buttermilk's flavor is left behind, and there is still enough leavening for fluffy pancakes. Some recipes call for baking soda, while others call for baking powder. Which ingredient is used depends on the other ingredients in the recipe. The ultimate goal is to produce a tasty product with a pleasing texture. Baking soda is basic and will yield a bitter taste unless countered by the acidity of another ingredient, such as buttermilk. You'll find baking soda in cookie recipes. Baking powder contains both an acid and a base and has an overall neutral effect in terms of taste. Recipes that call for baking powder often call for other neutral-tasting ingredients, such as milk. Baking powder is a common ingredient in cakes and biscuits. How to test baking powder. To test baking powder, pour 3 tablespoons of warm water into a small bowl. Add 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder. Give it a light stir. The mixture should moderately fizz if the powder is fresh. If there is no reaction, toss the baking powder and buy a fresh package. How to test baking soda. To test baking soda, pour 3 tablespoons of white distilled vinegar into a small bowl. Add 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda. Give it a light stir. The mixture should rapidly bubble if the soda is fresh. If there is no reaction, toss the baking soda and buy a fresh package. Substituting in recipes. You can substitute baking powder for baking soda. You'll need more baking powder and it may affect the taste, but you can't use baking soda when a recipe calls for baking powder. Baking soda by itself lacks the acidity to make a cake rise. However, you can make your own baking powder if you have baking soda and cream of tartar. Simply mix 2 parts cream of tartar with 1 part baking soda. Please check the link down below in the description for more information. If you love with kind of videos like this, leave comment, share with your friends and hit the subscribe button. See you in the next video.